The Galactic Cognitive Development Academy hung suspended in the delicate embrace of the Crimson Nebula, its crystalline structure refracting starlight into a mesmerizing display of cosmic artistry. Dr. Emily Rodriguez adjusted the neural interface behind her left ear, feeling the subtle hum of technology synchronizing with her brainwaves. Around her, the lecture hall represented a biological and technological marvel that defied traditional understanding of sentient life. To her left, Sarl, a silicon-based life form from the crystalline confederacy, existed as a shimmering geometric construct of interconnected prismatic surfaces. Each movement produced a soft chiming sound, like delicate wind chimes made of pure crystal. Beside Sarl, Brunak composed himself as a carefully contained cloud of luminescent gas, his molecular structure constantly shifting and realigning to maintain communication and cognitive function. The mechanical students from the Syndicate of Rational Worlds looked like intricate sculptures of living metal. Their exoskeletons were composed of adaptive nanomaterials that could reconfigure themselves based on environmental needs and computational requirements. Each of these students represented a different approach to intelligence. Some relied on pure computational power, others on adaptive learning, and a few on intuitive problem-solving. Professor Zixtal entered the lecture hall, and the entire room seemed to adjust its atmospheric pressure. The being was not a singular entity, but a complex network of energy filaments that could simultaneously exist in multiple dimensional states. His presence commanded attention without a single spoken word. Tendrils of electromagnetic energy drifted around him, creating intricate patterns that spoke of complex mathematical equations and philosophical theorems. "Welcome," Professor Zixtal began, his communication occurring simultaneously through sound, electromagnetic pulses, and direct neural transmission, to the most challenging cognitive assessment in galactic academic history. A holographic display erupted in the center of the lecture hall, showcasing a complex three-dimensional representation of what appeared to be an impossible geometric structure. The image shifted and changed, defying traditional understanding of spatial relationships. Emily noticed how her fellow students reacted. Sarl's crystalline surfaces began to pulse with complex computational algorithms, attempting to map the holographic structure. The mechanical students from the Syndicate ran rapid diagnostics, their metallic surfaces flickering with streams of data. Brunak's gaseous form condensed and expanded, suggesting intense internal processing. The quantum labyrinth, Professor Zixtal continued, has challenged the most advanced cognitive entities in our known universe. It is a simulation that tests not just intelligence, but the very nature of problem-solving and perceptual understanding. A young student from a methane-based ecosystem raised a tentacle-like appendage. "Professor, how many students have successfully completed this challenge?" Zixtal's energy filaments pulsed with what could only be described as academic amusement. In the last 3,000 academic cycles, precisely 0 students have successfully navigated the entire simulation. Whispers, both audible and electromagnetic, rippled through the lecture hall. Emily remained calm, her fingers unconsciously tracing complex patterns on her data tablet. She had always been more interested in the approach to a problem than the problem itself. The simulation, Professor Zixtal explained, is designed to be impossible. It adapts to each student's cognitive approach, creating barriers that are specifically tailored to block their unique method of problem-solving. Mathematical solutions become linguistic puzzles. Computational approaches transform into quantum entanglement challenges. The holographic display continued to shift, showing glimpses of impossible geometries and recursive logic structures that seemed to defy the very laws of physics and mathematical understanding. Emily watched the display with a hint of a smile. Where others saw an insurmountable challenge, she saw a complex system waiting to be understood. Her background in psychology had taught her that every system, no matter how complex, had an underlying logic. It was just a matter of perspective. As Professor Zixtal continued his explanation, the students around her began preparing their cognitive tools. Sarl's computational matrices expanded. The mechanical students synchronized their neural networks. Brennac's gaseous form began to develop intricate internal structures. Little did they know that Emily's approach would be entirely different. The lecture hall transformed as Professor Zixtal activated the comprehensive simulation briefing. Holographic displays cascaded around the students, each projection representing a different dimensional perspective of the quantum labyrinth. What initially appeared as a simple geometric structure revealed itself as a multi-layered cognitive challenge that defied traditional understanding of space, time, and problem-solving. The quantum labyrinth, Professor Zixtal explained, his energy tendrils weaving through the holographic displays, is more than a mere simulation. It is a living cognitive ecosystem designed to challenge the fundamental limits of intelligent navigation. The hologram shifted, revealing layers of complexity that seemed to breathe and pulse with their own form of intelligence. Mathematical equations danced alongside linguistic puzzles. Geometric shapes morphed into intricate logical challenges. Quantum entanglement problems intertwined with cultural comprehension tests. Sarl's crystalline structure began to vibrate with anticipation. The mechanical students from the Syndicate of Rational Worlds synchronized their neural networks, preparing to approach the challenge with pure computational power. Brennac's gaseous form condensed and expanded, creating internal structures that mimicked complex computational matrices. Each student, Professor Zixtal continued, will enter the simulation individually. The labyrinth adapts in real time, creating challenges specifically designed to challenge your cognitive weaknesses. What works for one species will become a barrier for another. A holographic display showed previous attempts. Recordings of students from various civilizations flickered by, some spending weeks trapped in single sections of the labyrinth, others breaking down under the cognitive pressure, fractured mathematical equations, impossible linguistic riddles, quantum paradoxes that seemed to twist the very fabric of logical reasoning. The methane-based student from earlier raised a trembling appendage. "Professor, how can we possibly prepare?" Zixtal's energy patterns suggested something close to amusement. Preparation is impossible. The quantum labyrinth deconstructs traditional problem-solving approaches. It is not about finding a solution, but about understanding the nature of challenges themselves. Emily listened carefully, her fingers unconsciously tracing complex patterns on her data tablet. Where others saw an insurmountable challenge, she saw a system waiting to be understood. Her background in psychology had taught her that every complex system has an underlying logic. It was just a matter of perspective. The holographic display zoomed into microscopic levels, revealing the labyrinth's adaptive capabilities. Quantum locks that could reconfigure themselves based on a student's cognitive approach. Linguistic barriers that transformed mathematical solutions into philosophical conundrums. Computational challenges that became biological adaptation tests. Previous attempts, Professor Zixtal noted, have resulted in various outcomes. Some students have been trapped for academic cycles. Others have experienced significant cognitive fatigue. A few have required extensive neural recalibration after their attempts. The mechanical students from the Syndicate began running predictive models, their metallic surfaces flickering with complex data streams. Sarl's crystalline form pulsed with computational algorithms, attempting to map potential navigation strategies. Brennac's gaseous structure began to develop increasingly complex internal reasoning structures. The challenge begins in one standard chronological unit, Professor Zixtal announced. Each of you will be digitally transferred into the quantum labyrinth. Your objective is simple: find a way to exit. Simple perhaps, but the previous holographic evidence suggested anything but simplicity. Emily noticed how her fellow students prepared. Sarl began constructing elaborate mathematical models. The mechanical students synchronized their most advanced predictive algorithms. Brennac attempted to develop a communication strategy with the simulation's underlying intelligence. Her approach would be entirely different. The lecture hall hummed with a mixture of excitement, fear, and profound anticipation. The quantum labyrinth waited, a challenge that had defeated countless advanced civilizations, a test that promised to push the boundaries of cognitive understanding. And Emily was ready. The digital transfer process began with a subtle vibration that resonated through every molecular structure in the lecture hall. Emily felt the neural interface behind her ear activate, creating a seamless bridge between her consciousness and the virtual environment. Around her, the other students underwent their own unique transfer processes. Sarl's crystalline form began to shimmer, his molecular structure breaking down into millions of precise digital packets. The mechanical students from the Syndicate of Rational Worlds initiated complex synchronization protocols, their metallic bodies converting into streams of pure computational data. Brennac's gaseous composition transformed into a complex network of quantum information, his entire being becoming a fluid digital representation. The moment of transfer was neither instantaneous nor gradual. It existed in a state of quantum uncertainty, a transition that defied traditional understanding of movement and consciousness. When perception stabilized, the students found themselves in an environment that challenged every fundamental concept of reality. The quantum labyrinth was not a place in any traditional sense. It was a living, breathing cognitive ecosystem that responded to thought, adaptation, and perception. Sarl was the first to react. His crystalline computational matrix began analyzing the environment, breaking down the complex geometries into mathematical models. Fractal patterns emerged and dissolved, creating recursive loops of impossible logic. Where other beings might see chaos, Sarl saw potential computational pathways. Each twist and turn a potential algorithm waiting to be solved. The mechanical students from the Syndicate approached the challenge with pure computational precision. Their digital representations began running millions of predictive models per microsecond. They attempted to map the environment, create navigation strategies, and predict potential barriers. Each movement was a calculated risk, each decision the result of complex probabilistic analysis. Brennac's gaseous form proved most adaptive. As a being capable of molecular reconfiguration, he could transform his entire cognitive structure to meet the labyrinth's challenges. His approach was fluid, changing moment by moment. Where a barrier appeared, he would restructure himself. Where a challenge presented itself, he would modify his internal computational processes. Emily observed. Her approach was fundamentally different from her fellow students. Where Sarl saw mathematical models, where the mechanical students saw computational challenges. Where Brennac saw molecular adaptability, Emily saw a system. Not just a challenge to be solved, but a living, breathing entity with its own internal logic. The labyrinth seemed to breathe around them. Geometric shapes twisted and transformed. Mathematical equations became linguistic challenges. Quantum entanglement problems morphed into cultural comprehension tests. The environment was not static. It was dynamic, adaptive, alive. Sarl's first approach involved creating comprehensive mathematical models. His crystalline structure began generating complex equations, attempting to predict and navigate the labyrinth's recursive logic. But each time he developed a model, the environment would shift, rendering his calculations obsolete. The mechanical students initiated a different strategy. They began running simultaneous computational approaches, creating millions of potential navigation scenarios per microsecond. Their metallic digital representations moved with precise, calculated movements. Yet each path they chose seemed to lead to another complex challenge, another impossible barrier. Brennac's approach was most fascinating. His gaseous form could reshape itself, flowing through potential pathways, adapting to each new challenge. He could become dense or diffuse, computational or intuitive, structured or chaotic. But even his remarkable adaptability seemed insufficient against the labyrinth's constant transformations. Hours passed, or what seemed like hours in an environment where time itself was a malleable concept. Emily remained calm. She understood something her fellow students had not yet realized. The quantum labyrinth was not a problem to be solved. It was a conversation to be understood. Her fingers, digital representations though they were, began to move with a rhythm that seemed almost musical. Where others saw barriers, she began to see patterns. Where her classmates constructed complex theories, she found elegant, simple solutions. The labyrinth watched and waited. Time became a fluid concept within the quantum labyrinth. What might have been hours in traditional space transformed into a series of cognitive challenges that tested the very limits of perception and understanding. Searle's computational approach had become a study in escalating frustration. The crystalline students' mathematical models, once precise and elegant, now lay in fractured digital fragments. Each time he constructed a comprehensive algorithm to navigate the labyrinth, the environment would shift, not just slightly, but fundamentally. Recursive loops became impossible mazes. Logical pathways dissolved into quantum uncertainties. The mechanical students from the syndicate of rational worlds experienced their own form of cognitive breakdown. Their simultaneous computational approaches, which had initially seemed so promising, now created a feedback loop of increasing complexity. Each predictive model generated thousands of potential scenarios, but the labyrinth remained perpetually one step ahead. Their metallic digital representations began to show signs of strain. Computational patterns fragmenting, predictive capabilities diminishing. Brennac's gaseous form provided the most dynamic response to the challenges. As a being capable of molecular reconfiguration, he could adapt in ways other species could not. His cognitive structure flowed like liquid thought, reshaping itself constantly. One moment, he would become dense and computational, attempting to analyze the labyrinth's structure. The next, he would diffuse into a cloud of intuitive exploration, seeking patterns through pure perception. Yet even Brennac's remarkable adaptability began to show signs of strain. The labyrinth was more than a challenge. It was a living cognitive ecosystem that seemed to feed on the students' attempts to understand it. Mathematical equations would transform into linguistic riddles. Computational pathways would become biological adaptation challenges. What seemed like a straightforward navigation problem would suddenly require understanding of complex cultural paradigms from civilizations long extinct. Professor Zixtal observed from an external monitoring system, his energy filaments pulsing with academic intensity. This was more than a simple test. It was a comprehensive examination of cognitive limitations. Each student approached the challenge differently, yet all found themselves equally challenged. Emily remained the most intriguing subject of observation. While her fellow students fought against the labyrinth's challenges, she seemed to be engaging in a different kind of interaction. Her digital representation moved with a fluidity that defied traditional problem-solving approaches. Where others saw barriers, she seemed to see conversations. Where computational approaches failed, she appeared to be listening. The methane-based student from the initial lecture, now also trapped in the simulation, began to show signs of cognitive fatigue. Its tentacle-like appendages, digital representations though they were, moved with increasing desperation. The labyrinth had begun to target individual cognitive weaknesses, creating challenges that struck at the most fundamental levels of each species' reasoning. Searle's computational models became increasingly erratic. Where he once generated precise mathematical equations, now his digital representation produced fractured, almost poetic representations of logic. The crystal-based intelligence was being forced to think beyond its traditional computational frameworks. The mechanical students from the syndicate underwent their own transformation. Their precise, calculated movements gave way to something more chaotic. They began to generate solutions that defied their original programming. Creative, almost intuitive approaches that seemed to emerge from the very process of struggle. Brennac's gaseous form began to show the most dramatic changes. No longer simply adapting, the being began to merge with the labyrinth's own cognitive structures. The line between observer and environment began to blur. And through it all, Emily remained calm. Her fingers continued their subtle, almost musical movement. She was not fighting the labyrinth. She was not trying to solve it. She was experiencing it. The monitoring systems captured everything. Professor Zixtal watched with increasing fascination. This was becoming more than an academic challenge. This was a fundamental exploration of intelligence itself. The quantum labyrinth continued its relentless cognitive dance, waiting to see what would emerge. The moment of transformation began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Emily's approach to the quantum labyrinth was not about conquering or solving, but about understanding. Where her fellow students saw a challenge to be defeated, she saw a complex system waiting to be comprehended. Her fingers moved with a rhythm that seemed to transcend traditional computational logic. Each movement was a conversation, each gesture a form of communication that went beyond the traditional boundaries of problem-solving. The labyrinth itself seemed to pause, to listen. Sarl, still trapped in his fractured computational model, watched with increasing bewilderment. The crystalline student's mathematical approaches had long since dissolved into fragments of impossible logic. Emily's method defied every computational model he had ever conceived. She was not calculating. She was not predicting. She was interpreting. The mechanical students from the Syndicate of Rational Worlds had reached a critical point of cognitive strain. Their precise, calculated movements had given way to something more chaotic, more organic. They observed Emily with what could only be described as digital fascination. Her approach suggested something fundamental that their programming had never anticipated, a form of intelligence that was not about solving, but about understanding. Brennac's gaseous form had become almost indistinguishable from the labyrinth itself. The being of molecular adaptability had merged so completely with the cognitive environment that the line between observer and observed had become meaningless. Yet even in this state of complete immersion, Brannack was aware of something unique happening around Emily. She began to interact with the labyrinth as if it were a living entity. Not as a problem to be solved, but as a conversation to be understood. Her digital representation moved with a fluidity that defied traditional understanding of navigation. Where others saw barriers, she saw potential. Where computational approaches failed, she found pathways. The labyrinth responded. Geometric shapes that had previously been impenetrable began to shift. Mathematical equations that had trapped other students became transparent. Linguistic riddles that had seemed impossible began to unravel. It was as if the very environment was engaging in a dialogue with Emily, revealing its underlying structure not through force, but through understanding. Professor Zixtal's energy filaments pulsed with academic intensity. The monitoring systems captured every microscopic detail of the interaction. This was more than a simple test of cognitive capabilities. This was a fundamental exploration of intelligence itself. Emily's approach broke every established rule of problem-solving. She was not fighting against the labyrinth. She was not attempting to outsmart it or break through its defenses. Instead, she was listening. Her movements became a form of communication, each gesture a subtle probe into the labyrinth's underlying logic. The methane-based student, still trapped in its own cognitive struggle, watched with increasing fascination. What was happening defied every understanding of challenge and resolution. Emily was not solving the labyrinth. She was understanding it. Sarl's computational matrix began to recalibrate. The crystalline student's understanding of problem-solving was fundamentally challenged. Mathematical models gave way to something more fluid, more intuitive. Emily was demonstrating a form of intelligence that went beyond calculation, an approach that was simultaneously more simple and more complex than any computational method. The mechanical students from the syndicate began to modify their own approach. Their precise, calculated movements became more fluid. They were learning, adapting, watching how Emily engaged with the cognitive environment. Brannack's gaseous form began to separate from the labyrinth's structure, drawn by the unique interaction unfolding. The being of molecular adaptability recognized something profound was occurring, a form of communication that transcended traditional understanding. The labyrinth itself seemed to breathe. Geometric shapes became fluid. Mathematical equations transformed into living conversations. Linguistic challenges dissolved into pure understanding. Emily was not conquering the environment, she was becoming part of it. And through it all, her fingers continued their subtle, almost musical movement. A conversation was happening, not between a student and a challenge, but between two forms of intelligence discovering each other. The quantum labyrinth watched and listened. The transformation happened with a suddenness that defied conventional understanding. Emily's interaction with the quantum labyrinth reached a critical point of synchronization that caused the entire cognitive environment to shudder. Her fingers, which had been moving in subtle, almost musical patterns, now traced complex pathways that seemed to exist between dimensions of thought. Where others had seen impenetrable barriers, she found elegant solutions. The labyrinth's adaptive systems, designed to challenge the most advanced intelligences in the galaxy, began to unravel. Quantum locks that had previously been impregnable started to dissolve, not through computational force or mathematical precision, but through a form of understanding that transcended traditional problem-solving approaches. Emily was not breaking through the barriers, she was revealing them. Searle's computational matrix, which had been fractured and desperate, began to stabilize. The crystalline student watched in absolute amazement as Emily's approach demonstrated a fundamental truth about intelligence that challenged everything he understood. Mathematical models gave way to something more fluid, more intuitive. The mechanical students from the Syndicate of Rational Worlds experienced a collective moment of cognitive recalibration. Their precise, calculated movements transformed. They were witnessing something beyond their programming, a form of problem-solving that emerged from understanding rather than computation. Brunak's gaseous form condensed, creating intricate internal structures of pure observation. The being of molecular adaptability recognized a profound moment of cognitive breakthrough. Emily was not conquering the labyrinth, she was communicating with it. Professor Zixtal's energy filaments pulsed with academic intensity. The monitoring systems captured every microscopic detail of the interaction. What was happening defied every established understanding of intelligence, problem-solving, and cognitive interaction. The labyrinth's adaptive systems began to respond in ways no one had anticipated. Geometric shapes became fluid. Mathematical equations transformed into living conversations. Linguistic challenges dissolved into pure understanding. Emily was revealing the underlying structure of the cognitive environment by engaging with it, not fighting against it. In 10 minutes, she accomplished what no previous student had even approached in thousands of academic cycles. The methane-based student, still trapped in its own cognitive struggle, watched with increasing fascination. What was happening defied every understanding of challenge and resolution. Emily was demonstrating a form of intelligence that went beyond species-specific limitations. Computational pathways that had been impossibly complex began to simplify, not through brute force or advanced algorithms, but through a subtle form of comprehension that recognized the fundamental nature of the challenge. Emily was not solving the labyrinth, she was understanding its very essence. Searle's crystalline structure began to vibrate with a new form of excitement. The student's understanding of problem-solving was being fundamentally reconstructed. Mathematical precision gave way to a more holistic approach, one that recognized intelligence as a form of communication rather than a computational challenge. The mechanical students from the Syndicate underwent a profound transformation. Their rigid, calculated approach dissolved, replaced by a more fluid, adaptive method of interaction. They were learning, in real time, a fundamentally new approach to understanding complex systems. Brunak's gaseous form began to resonate with the labyrinth's changing structure. The being of molecular adaptability recognized a moment of profound cognitive evolution. Intelligence was not about defeating challenges, but about understanding them. The labyrinth itself seemed to breathe. Barriers that had seemed insurmountable moments ago now became transparent. Challenges that had trapped advanced civilizations for academic cycles dissolved with elegant simplicity. Emily was not fighting against the environment. she was becoming part of its fundamental understanding. Professor Zixtel could barely process what was happening. The monitoring systems captured a moment that would redefine understanding of intelligence across the galaxy. This was more than a simple academic challenge. This was a fundamental exploration of cognitive potential. In 10 minutes, Emily had accomplished what no other student had even approached. The quantum labyrinth had met its match. The aftermath of Emily's breakthrough sent shockwaves through the entire Galactic Cognitive Development Academy. Professor Zixtal's monitoring systems captured every microscopic detail of the transformation, creating a comprehensive record that would challenge fundamental understanding of intelligence across multiple civilizations. As the students emerged from the quantum labyrinth, the cognitive differences became immediately apparent. Sarl's crystalline structure vibrated with a new form of understanding. The mechanical students from the Syndicate of Rational Worlds moved with a fluidity that defied their previous computational rigidity. Brennac's gaseous form had become something more nuanced, more adaptive. But Emily stood out most distinctly. The academic review board assembled within moments of the simulation's completion. Holographic projections from representatives of hundreds of different species filled the conference chamber. Each delegation represented a different approach to intelligence, a different understanding of cognitive potential. What we witnessed, Professor Zixtel began, his energy filaments pulsing with academic intensity, is nothing short of a fundamental redefinition of problem-solving. The methane-based student who had observed Emily's approach provided the first testimony. Its tentacle-like appendages moved with a combination of excitement and academic precision. The being described Emily's method not as a solution, but as a form of communication with the cognitive environment. Sarl's report was perhaps the most technical. The crystalline student broke down Emily's approach using complex mathematical models, demonstrating how her method transcended traditional computational thinking. Mathematical equations became living representations of cognitive interaction, showing how Emily had essentially conversed with the quantum labyrinth rather than attempting to defeat it. The mechanical students from the Syndicate presented a comprehensive analysis that challenged their own foundational programming. Their report suggested that Emily's approach represented a form of intelligence that was simultaneously more simple and more complex than any computational method they had previously encountered. Brennac's contribution was perhaps the most philosophical. The gaseous being described the interaction as a form of molecular communication that went beyond traditional understanding of problem-solving. Intelligence, Brennac suggested, was not about conquering challenges, but about understanding them at their most fundamental level. Professor Zixtel's own analysis revealed the true depth of Emily's breakthrough. The quantum labyrinth had been designed as an ultimate test of cognitive capabilities, a simulation that had defeated the most advanced intelligences in the galaxy for thousands of academic cycles. Yet Emily had navigated it in mere minutes, not through computational power, but through a form of understanding that defied traditional explanation. The academic implications were profound. Entire research paradigms would need to be reconstructed. Understanding of intelligence would need to be fundamentally reimagined. Emily had demonstrated something that went beyond species-specific cognitive approaches, a form of problem-solving that was both universal and deeply personal. Diplomatic representatives from various galactic councils began to take notice. This was more than an academic breakthrough. This was a fundamental revelation about the nature of intelligence itself. The methane-based students' report highlighted how Emily's approach suggested that intelligence was not about computational power or species-specific abilities. It was about communication, about understanding, about the ability to see beyond established systems. Sarl's mathematical models suggested that Emily's method could revolutionize approach to complex problem-solving across multiple scientific disciplines. The crystalline student's analysis showed how her approach could be applied to everything from quantum physics to interstellar diplomacy. The mechanical students from the Syndicate began developing new computational frameworks based on Emily's breakthrough. Their rigid, previous understanding of problem-solving was being fundamentally reconstructed. Bernac's philosophical analysis suggested that this was more than an individual achievement. This was a moment of collective cognitive evolution. Professor Zixtal understood something profound had occurred. The quantum labyrinth, a challenge designed to be impossible, had been transformed. Not defeated, but understood. And at the center of it all was Emily, who had shown that true intelligence is not about solving challenges, but about understanding them. The galaxy would never be the same. The ripples of Emily's breakthroughs spread far beyond the Galactic Cognitive Development Academy. Academic institutions across hundreds of star systems began to reevaluate their fundamental understanding of intelligence, problem-solving, and cognitive potential. 5 standard cycles after the quantum labyrinth incident, Emily found herself at the center of a galactic conversation that challenged everything previously understood about intelligent life. Research centers from multiple civilizations requested her insights. Diplomatic missions sought her perspective on complex interstellar challenges. The mechanical students from the Syndicate of Rational Worlds had completely redesigned their computational frameworks. Where they once relied on pure algorithmic processing, they now incorporated adaptive learning models inspired by Emily's approach. Their new systems emphasized understanding over calculation, communication over computation. Sarl's research team developed entirely new mathematical models that incorporated the fluid, intuitive approach Emily had demonstrated. The crystalline civilization began teaching a revolutionary approach to problem-solving in their educational systems. Students were now encouraged to see challenges as conversations rather than obstacles to be conquered. Bernac's Philosophical Institute published groundbreaking research that redefined intelligence across multiple dimensions. The gaseous civilization began exploring cognitive interaction as a form of molecular communication, moving beyond traditional understanding of intelligent response. Professor Zixtal, once a rigid academic focused on traditional cognitive testing, had become the most vocal advocate for a new approach to understanding intelligence. The being's energy filaments now pulsed with an excitement that spoke to fundamental transformation. Intelligence, Zixtal would explain in lectures across the galaxy, is not about solving challenges. It is about understanding them. It is about the ability to see beyond established systems, to communicate with complexity rather than fight against it. The quantum labyrinth itself underwent a transformation. No longer a test to be conquered, it became a research tool. Academic institutions used it to explore the nature of cognitive interaction, with Emily's approach serving as the foundational model. Diplomatic missions began applying the new understanding to interstellar challenges. Complex cultural misunderstandings that had previously seemed insurmountable now found resolution through approaches that emphasized communication and understanding over conflict and competition. The methane-based student who had witnessed Emily's breakthrough became a prominent researcher, developing new methodologies for cross-species cognitive interaction. Their work suggested that intelligence was a form of universal language, transcending biological and technological boundaries. Emily herself remained somewhat bemused by the global transformation. Her background in psychology had prepared her to see beyond established systems, but the magnitude of the impact surprised even her. She continued her research, exploring the fundamental nature of intelligence across different civilizations. The Galactic Council established a new research initiative dedicated to exploring cognitive potential. Funded by contributions from hundreds of different species, the program sought to understand the nature of intelligence beyond species-specific limitations. Sarl's mathematical models demonstrated that Emily's approach could be applied to challenges far beyond the quantum labyrinth. From quantum physics to interstellar diplomacy, the new understanding suggested that true problem-solving was about communication, not confrontation. The mechanical students from the Syndicate developed adaptive technologies that could learn and grow in ways previously unimaginable. Their new computational systems could engage with complex challenges, adapting in real time rather than relying on predetermined algorithms. Brennach's philosophical work suggested that intelligence was a form of universal energy, a way of interacting with the universe that transcended biological, technological, and dimensional boundaries. The research challenged fundamental understanding of consciousness itself. Professor Zichtol's final academic paper, published in the most prestigious journal of cognitive studies, bore a simple title, Beyond Solving, A New Understanding of Intelligence. The galaxy had changed. Where once intelligence was measured by computational power or problem-solving ability, now it was understood as a form of communication, a way of engaging with complexity that went beyond species, technology, or dimensional limitations. And it had all begun with one human's unique approach to a seemingly impossible challenge.